The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Book 2. That sovereignty is inalienable. The first and most important deduction from the principles we have so far laid down is that the general will alone can direct the state according to the object for which it was instituted, i.e., the common good. For if the clashing of particular interests made the establishment of societies necessary, the agreement of these very interests made it possible. The common element in these different interests is what forms the social tie, and, were there no point of agreement between them all, no society could exist. It is solely on the basis of this common interest that every society should be governed. I hold then that the sovereignty, being nothing less than the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated, and that the sovereign, who is no less than a collective being, cannot be represented except by himself. The power indeed may be transmitted, but not the will. In reality, if it is not impossible for a particular will to agree on some point with the general will, it is at least impossible for the agreement to be lasting and constant, for the particular will tends, by its very nature, to partiality, while the general will tends to equality. It is even more impossible to have any guarantee of this agreement, for even if it should always exist, it would be the effect not of art, but of chance. The sovereign may indeed say, I now will actually what this man wills, or at least what he says he wills. But it cannot say, when he wills tomorrow, I too shall will, because it is absurd for the will to bind itself for the future, nor is it incumbent on any will to consent to anything that is not for the good of the being who wills. If then the people promises simply to obey, by that very act it dissolves itself and loses what makes it a people. The moment a master exists, there is no longer a sovereign, and from that moment the body politic has ceased to exist. This does not mean that the commands of the rulers cannot pass for general wills, so long as the sovereign, being free to oppose them, offers no opposition. In such a case, universal silence is taken to imply the consent of the people. This will be explained later on. 2. That sovereignty is indivisible. Sovereignty, for the same reason as makes it inalienable, is indivisible, for will either is or is not general. It is the will either of the body of the people or only of a part of it. In the first case, the will, when declared, is an act of sovereignty and constitutes law. In the second, it is merely a particular will, or act of magistracy, at the most a decree. But our political theorists, unable to divide sovereignty in principle, divide it according to its object, into force and will, into legislative power and executive power, into rights of taxation, justice and war, into internal administration and power of foreign treaty. Sometimes they confuse all these sections, and sometimes they distinguish them. They turn the sovereign into a fantastic being, composed of several connected pieces. It is as if they were making man of several bodies, one with eyes, one with arms, another with feet, and each with nothing besides. We are told that the jugglers of Japan dismember a child before the eyes of the spectators. Then they throw all the members into the air, one after another, and the child falls down, alive and whole. The conjuring tricks of our political theorists are very like that. They first dismember the body politic by an illusion worthy of a fair, and then they join it together again, we know not how. This error is due to a lack of exact notions concerning the sovereign authority, and to taking for parts of it what are only emanations from it. Thus, for example, the acts of declaring war and making peace have been regarded as acts of sovereignty, but this is not the case, as these acts do not constitute law, but merely the application of a law, a particular act which decides how the law applies, as we shall see clearly when the idea attached to the word law has been defined. If we examine the other divisions in the same manner, we should find that, whenever sovereignty seems to be divided, there is an illusion. The rights which are taken as being part of sovereignty are really all subordinate, and always imply supreme wills, of which they only sanction the execution. It would be impossible to estimate the obscurity this lack of exactness has thrown over the decisions of writers who have dealt with political right, when they have used the principles laid down by them to pass judgment on the respective rights of kings and people. Everyone can see in chapters 3 and 4 of the books of Grotius how the learned man and his translator, Barbeyrac, entangle and tie themselves up in their own sophistries, for fear of saying too little or too much of what they think, and so offending the interests they have to conciliate. Grotius, a refugee in France, ill content with his own country and desirous of paying his court to Louis XIII, to whom his book is dedicated, spares no pains to rob the people of all their rights and invest kings with them by every conceivable artifice. This would also have been much to the taste of Barbeyrac, who dedicated his translation to George I of England, but unfortunately, the expulsion of James II, which he called his abdication, compelled him to use all reserve, to shuffle and to tergiversate, in order to avoid making William out a usurper. If these two writers had adopted the true principles, all difficulties would have been removed, and they would have been always consistent. But it would have been a sad truth for them to tell, and would have paid court for them to no one save the people. Moreover, truth is no road to fortune, and the people dispenses neither ambassadorships, nor professorships, nor pensions. 3. Whether the general will is fallible. It follows from what has gone before that the general will is always right and tends to the public advantage. But it does not follow that the deliberations of the people are always equally correct. Our will is always for our own good, but we do not always see what that is. The people is never corrupted, but it is often deceived, and on such occasions only does it seem to will what is bad. There is often a great deal of difference between the will of all and the general will. The latter considers only the common interest, while the former takes private interest into account and is no more than a sum of particular wills. But take away from these same wills the pluses and minuses that cancel one another, and the general will remains as the sum of the differences. If, when the people, being furnished with adequate information, held its deliberations, the citizens had no communication one with another, the grand total of the small differences would always give the general will, and the decision would always be good. But when factions arise and partial associations are formed at the expense of the great association, the will of each of these associations becomes general in relation to its members, while it remains particular in relation to the state. It may then be said that there are no longer as many votes as there are men, but only as many as there are associations. The differences become less numerous and give a less general result. Lastly, when one of these associations is so great as to prevail over all the rest, the result is no longer a sum of small differences, but a single difference. In this case, there is no longer a general will, and the opinion which prevails is purely particular. It is therefore essential, if the general will is to be able to express itself, then there should be no partial society within the state, and that each citizen should think only his own thoughts, which was indeed the sublime and unique system established by the great Lycurgus. But if there are partial societies, it is best to have as many as possible, and to prevent them from being unequal, as was done by Solon, Numa, and Servius. These precautions are the only ones that can guarantee that the general will shall be always enlightened, and that the people shall in no way deceive itself. 4. The limits of the sovereign power. If the state is a moral person, whose life is in the union of its members, and if the most important of its cares is the care for its own preservation, it must have a universal and compelling force, in order to move and dispose each part as may be most advantageous to the whole. As nature gives each man absolute power over all his members, the social compact gives the body politic absolute power over all its members also. And it is this power which, under the direction of the general will, bears, as I have said, the name of sovereignty. But, besides the public person, we have to consider the private persons composing it, whose life and liberty are naturally independent of it. We are bound then to distinguish clearly between the respective rights of the citizens and the sovereign, and between the duties the former have to fulfill as subjects, and the natural rights they should enjoy as men. Each man alienates, I admit, by the social compact only such part of his powers, goods, and liberty as it is important for the community to control. But it must also be granted that the sovereign is sole judge of what is important. Every service a citizen can render the state he ought to render as soon as the sovereign demands it. But the sovereign, for its part, cannot impose upon its subjects any fetters that are useless to the community, nor can it even wish to do so, for no more by the law of reason than by the law of nature can anything occur without a cause. The undertakings which bind us to the social body are obligatory only because they are mutual, and their nature is such that in fulfilling them we cannot work for others without working for ourselves. Why is it that the general will is always in the right, and that all continually will the happiness of each other? Unless it is because there is not a man who does not think of each as meaning him, and consider himself in voting for all. This proves that equality of rights and the idea of justice with such equality originate in the preference each man gives to himself, and accordingly in the very nature of man. It proves that the general will, to be really such, must be general in its object as well as its essence, that it must both come from all and apply to all, and that it loses its natural rectitude when it is directed to some particular and determinate object, because in such a case we are judging of something foreign to us, and have no true principle of equity to guide us. Indeed, as soon as a question of particular fact or right arises on a point not previously regulated by a general convention, the matter becomes contentious. It is a case in which the individuals concerned are one party, but in which I can see neither the law that ought to be followed, nor the judge who ought to give the decision. In such a case, it would be absurd to propose to refer the question to an express decision of the general will, which can be only the conclusion reached by one of the parties and in consequence will be, for the other party, merely an external and particular will, inclined on this occasion to injustice and subject to error. Thus, just as a particular will cannot stand for the general will, in turn, changes its nature when its object is particular, and, as general, cannot pronounce on a man or a fact. When, for instance, the people of Athens nominated or displaced its rulers, decreed honors to one and imposed penalties on another, and, by a multitude of particular decrees, exercised all the functions of government indiscriminately, it had in such cases no longer a general will in the strict sense. It was acting no longer as sovereign, but as magistrate. This will seem contrary to current views, but I must be given time to expound my own. It should be seen from the foregoing that what makes the will general is less the number of voters than the common interest uniting them. For, under this system, each necessarily submits to the conditions he imposes on others, and this admirable agreement between interest and justice gives to the common deliberations an equitable character which at once vanishes when any particular question is discussed. In the absence of a common interest, to unite and identify the ruling of the judge with that of the party. From whatever side we approach our principle, we reach the same conclusion, that the social compact sets up among the citizens an equality of such a kind that they all bind themselves to observe the same conditions, and should therefore all enjoy the same rights. Thus, from the very nature of the compact, every act of sovereignty, i.e., every authentic act of the general will, binds or favors all the citizens equally, so that the sovereign recognizes only the body of the nation, and draws no distinctions between those of whom it is made up. What, then, strictly speaking, is an act of sovereignty? It is not a convention between a superior and an inferior, but a convention between the body and each of its members. It is legitimate because based on the social contract, and equitable because common to all, useful because it can have no other object than the general good, and stable because guaranteed by the public force and the supreme power. So long as the subjects have to submit only to conventions of this sort, they obey no one but their own will, and ask how far the respective rights of the sovereign and the citizens extend, is to ask up to what point the latter can enter into undertakings with themselves, each with all and all with each. We can see from this that the sovereign power, absolute, sacred, and inviolable as it is, does not and cannot exceed the limits of general conventions, and that every man may dispose at will of such goods and liberty as these conventions leave him, so that the sovereign never has a right to lay more charges on one subject than on another, because, in that case, the question becomes particular, and ceases to be within its competency. When these distinctions have once been admitted, it is seen to be so untrue that there is, in the social contract, any real renunciation on the part of the individuals, that the position in which they find themselves as a result of the contract is really preferable to that in which they were before. Instead of a renunciation, They have made an advantageous exchange. Instead of an uncertain and precarious way of living, they have got one that is better and more secure. Instead of natural independence, they have got liberty. Instead of the power to harm others, security for themselves. And instead of their strength, which others might overcome, a right which social union makes invincible. Their very life, which they have devoted to the state, is by it constantly protected. And when they risk it in the state's defense, what more are they doing than giving back what they have received from it? What are they doing that they would not do more often with greater danger in the state of nature, in which they would, inevitably, have to fight battles at the peril of their lives in defense of that which is the means of their preservation? All have indeed to fight when their country needs them, but then no one has ever to fight for himself. Do we not gain something by running, on behalf of what gives us security, only some of the risks we should have to run for ourselves, as soon as we lost it?